Singapore is not China light, okay? So if you live in Singapore, you are essentially living in the West. So Chinese people are not cowed into submissiveness. They are very vocal. When they get mad, they get mad. You're on YouTube, and you see them. China, 90 days collapse. China, 180-day collapse. 10 million views. China is going to collapse in 90 days. And people love those videos. I don't know why, but
I see.
But what I see on the digital front, I see digital technology and the use of digital technology to make your life better at a level in China that the US has not even fully comprehended.
大家好，我是老吴。今天我们要来听一位特别有发言权的人，聊聊他眼中的真实中国。他就是理查德·图灵。他是一位在中国生活超过15年的美国经济学家和畅销书作家。在来中国之前，他还曾在新加坡和欧洲工作过，因此他的观察角度非常独特。在这段对话里，他会用自己的亲身经历带我们走上一段破除迷思的旅程。首先，他会比较中国和新加坡的区别，来解释为什么新加坡和中国完全不同。接着，他会把视角转向美国，深入对比中美两国的思维方式，特别是中国人的集体观念与美国人推崇的个人英雄主义到底有怎样的差别。然后，他会正面回应网络上那些铺天盖地的中国崩溃论，并分享他每天亲眼看见的真实中国是什么样子。然后，他还会拿出一些让西方人完全想不到的日常案例，来展示中国在数字生活和科技应用上的领先程度。那接下来我们就一起走进理查德眼中的真实中国。
After living for quite a long period of time in China, then you came to Singapore, you moved to Singapore for a couple of years. Was it like weird for you? Was it like weird version of China kind of thing? Or like weird mix of like China and the West in Singapore?
No, that's a wonderful question. And so the answer is Singapore has a vibe that is very unique. And it certainly is not, for anybody listening who needs to keep this in perspective, Singapore is not China light, okay? So if you live in Singapore, you are essentially living in the West, whether you call it a UK-influenced version of the West or a US-influenced version of the West. It's a sort of a hybrid between the two, and that's fine. But it is not China. No way. It doesn't feel like China. It doesn't work like China. People don't think like China. Yes, people are of Chinese ancestry. That is true. But, these are people like me when I say I'm Italian. I've been substantially influenced by American culture because that's where my educational system was. So I can never compare myself to my Italian cousins here who've gone through the complete Italian education system. So a Chinese person living in Singapore has gone through a British education system to some degree. All right. So they can never compare themselves in totality with a native Chinese who's gone through that educational system. So they are very, very different.
Chinese and Americans, what's like the big things that are very, very different as how people think?
The one thing that I will say that they're similar on, before we talk about the differences, is that they both, mainland Chinese now has something called the Chinese dream. And, the dream is not very different than the American dream. And it's a good life for your children. It's a car, it's a home, it's material affluence to a certain degree. And those things are very much similar. But what you see that is extremely different is that in China, there is less emphasis on independent, I am going to be the hero or star and attain this dream through my own singular efforts, and a greater willingness to work with others in a company or in a group setting to attain. The dream is the same. You want to get to that point, but how you're going to get there is visualized differently. And we look in the United States toward Steve Jobs. I want to be Bill Gates. I want to be that individual star of greatness who achieves something wonderfully. And in China, you certainly see, you see that, you see the Jack Ma's and you see the others who are, who are tech wizards or, or great singular people who do great things and had great companies. But from a day-to-day level, I think you see a greater willingness to cooperate and be part of a larger entity that will get you there.
So it's a more sense of a community and communal efforts to get somewhere.
Yeah, I don't want to use the word communal because people will say, "Oh, communal is communist," and that's not really what people are thinking about on their day-to-day life. What people are thinking about is how to keep things calm, cool, collected, so we can all achieve a goal. Now, look, that isn't true for everyone. You talk.
Sure.
We're making really broad generalizations, which are very hard. I know. I've met with people in my career who have that sense that they want to be the hero or the star and do great things. I've worked with young Chinese people who frankly don't want to work and want to do the minimum amount of work. So, it's very hard to generalize over an ancient society, but still fundamentally on the workplace or in society, there is a very big difference between how Singaporeans see themselves, even if they are of Chinese ancestry, and how native Chinese view their world and think about themselves, both in the workplace and in their interaction with society.
So that's the similarity, kind of Chinese dream and American dream. They're kind of similar to some extent. What's the biggest differences of how like Chinese and Americans, again, we are generalizing, but what's the differences that you see in society, how people think?
That's a great question, and I'm going to hit a very tender topic right now. And it's near to my heart because I was born in the United States. But right now we have tremendous divisiveness in the United States between political right, political left, divisiveness over cultural issues, political correctness, being woke or not woke, as the expression goes. So there's divisiveness along many, many different lines of thought. It's not just Democrat, Republican, left, right divide. There's many different fractures happening in American society. And what's interesting to me is that you don't see that in China, in the sense that, and people are going to jump on this. They're going to say, "Oh, well, it's only one political party. You can't have a right or left." And that is obviously true. I do not deny that. But what's interesting is you still have this very high approval rating for the government. And somebody is now going to say, "Well, how can you actually do a poll?" Yes, they actually do polls. And actually, American and Western companies do polls of Chinese people. They're allowed to do that. And the government has this very high approval rating. And what government aside, what you don't see is the divisiveness. Okay? You don't see that in cultural issues on the streets of Shanghai. You don't see it over the government. Now, so there were periods of divisiveness. Clearly, you can go back to the revolution. This was a country that up till 1949 had a revolution. So people could be divided here. And during COVID also, toward the end of the COVID period here, there were divisiveness over how the government handled COVID. So Chinese people are not cowed into submissiveness. They are very vocal. When they get mad, they get mad. But in general, what we're seeing right now is, compared to the United States, is a more unified sense of purpose and of contentedness than what I see in the very fractured nature of the United States at this moment. And that matters. And so let me put it in context. So I write and work, everything I do is about technology. So what you see happening now in China for the adoption of artificial intelligence, the adoption of digital technology is beyond anything that most people can conceive of. I am older, I'm 64. In fact, I'm 64 in only 20 days. And I grew up during the United States' space race, when all of the United States worked to put people on the moon, right? So that was a unifying time of the United States. And that's exactly what I see going on in China today, with huge numbers of science, technology, educated young people, all of them going to work in artificial intelligence, many of them going to work for digital services. So you see this, sort of what's called in Chinese terms a whole society effort for digitization in China, because people believe and have ample evidence of this, that digitization has made China a better place for them to live. So that's, a good example of how, when I said it's less divisive and the society is moving toward a goal, and the goal is digitization and AI and all sorts of other great technologies. So it's an interesting place to be right now. And that's the sense of lack of the divisiveness that you see, that I feel we're living there now.
It's very interesting that you mentioned about the moon project in America, like in the 60s. So it was like a big idea for the nation, like a big thing for many people. And then it's like the American dream, that's the thing that people not from America, but I grew up in Russia, so I knew about this American dream thing. There was like the big idea for Americans. What's the big idea now for Chinese society, for Chinese people?
Right now, China is in an economic slowdown. It's got GDP growth of 5% as opposed to GDP growth of anything between 12 and 8%. For China, 5% GDP growth is considered like a recession in the West. So right now, the majority of young people, let's divide it, so right now, the question is for most people, can we maintain our standard of living with a lower sense of growth? Now, that's for somebody who's older and has a job. For young people, it's, can I find a job? And is it a decent job? And much more basic. Now, so the statistics used to be that China needed 8% GDP growth just to employ all of the young graduates coming out of university. So now with 5% GDP growth, there are a group of young people, all with good degrees. It's not about, it's not that they have degrees in art history or something, or music or something that's traditionally hard to get a job at. These young people have good degrees and they are taking forever to get employment, and many are seeking alternative employment. So this is going to sound terrible, but there's an entire group of young people who have decided to become delivery drivers. So they've got a degree in something. There's one guy who made the news. He has a PhD in physics, and he's doing delivery. Now, I'm not sure that's what he wants to do for all of his life, but he said, yes, I'm making money and I'm okay with this for now. But, so young people their desire is to simply find a job. Older people their concern is, how much do I spend? How much can I spend? And that's what the Chinese government has been working on. They've had programs to try to boost the economy through spending, to allow people to help them feel more confident in spending more money. Because people are saving what they've got, and the more people are saving, pull back from spending, the more the economy slows down. But there's something important, I think, for people in the West to get, and that is that there's no crisis. China is not collapsing. There is no, YouTube videos. You're on YouTube, and you see them. China, 90 days collapse. China, 180-day collapse. There's a whole genre of videos that are predicting China collapse. And I'm sorry, I live there every day, and I don't see the collapse. And, so it's sort of funny to see how that's an entire business is, pick 10 million views. China is going to collapse in 90 days. And people love those videos. I don't know why, but
I see these videos often, and they're also coming from like not only from individual like bloggers, YouTubers, but also from like official media kind of thing. But it's probably because Americans see China as a threat and they kind of nervous about it. I think for many people, China is like a black box. It's something there, something massive. They don't understand what's going on there. They think it's like a communist people like obey like orders and on like super suppressed. So I think there is a fear. I don't know. Tell me if I'm wrong. But in US, people think they don't know about China, and they kind of have this sense of fear about it.
Yeah, I think that's accurate. I think that China is now the number 2 GDP nation in the world. Number 1, having surpassed the United States. If you take GDP and weight it by what's called purchasing power parity, PPP GDP, they've actually surpassed the United States. So yeah, that's a concern. And people in the United States are concerned about China's rise, what it means long-term for the US. But I have a message. Nobody should be hoping for the fall of China. And so there's 2 radical fringe elements that come out of this. Okay, one is the China, and I guess let's roll them into one: China economic collapse or China political collapse. Let's put them all in one. It's the China collapse theory, and nobody should want that. Nobody should be, whether if you in the United States don't like China, absolutely fine, but no one should hope that a country of 1.4 billion people enters either economic or political collapse, because that's bad for everybody, right? You can't take the number 2 nation in the world who is supplying the US and much of the world with all of the things that you buy when you go to the store, have it collapse and have it be a good worldwide outcome, right? So, let's pull back on the rhetoric and understand that China is a big country. We're gonna live with it for a long time. China is not the same government, or is not the same. It is the same government, obviously, in name, since 1949, but their policies and how the government acts is not the same today as it was in 1976 or 75 during the Cultural Revolution, right? So the government in China changes. The name stays the same, but it changes. It views its world differently. So it's an evolving place, and that's fundamentally good. Don't hope for collapse. Hoping for collapse is a very bad thing for everyone.
Yeah, and it changes fast. I think people don't realize how China like changes like completely different in every 2 years, 3 years, especially the cities.
That's a really great point, Max, because I can come back to my town in Italy where my father lived, and we still have all these family. And if I were to come back in 5-year gaps, the difference between 0 and 5 years would be almost nothing. Actually, the 20 years you could come back, and it's the same. It's been the same town since 1500, right? But the point is, things change very slowly here, and I tell this to people, and I'm not joking. If I spend 2 months away traveling for work and doing other things out of Shanghai, when I come back, I walk in my neighborhood and I look at how many stores have changed, and I look at how much it's changed. So between expats related to this is when I meet somebody and they say, "Oh, I lived in Shanghai," my first question is when. Because if you lived in Shanghai, my first trip to Shanghai was 2003. I then moved here in 2000 or in 2010. The 7-year gap, what I saw when I came back in 2010 was incomprehensibly different. In fact, one funny thing is that I had to orient myself to the city a little bit in the early days when I was planning to move in 2010. I had a subway map, a metro map. And what I didn't realize is that when I actually got to the city in 2010, they had built 5 or 6 new metros. They built 1 metro a year from the time I had been there in 2003 till 7 years later when I got back in 2010. It really changes quickly. So it's a country that changes quickly. It's a place where people adapt relatively quickly. So it's kind of interesting to watch and, to be there. And it's exciting. I've spent 15 and a half years in Shanghai, and it's been every year is exciting with something new and different. That's all I can say.
You wrote 2 books, right?
Yes, I did indeed.
Yeah, so I just want to say that the latest one is Cashless. It was published in 2021. And so my question is actually like kind of inspired by the book and by your main thing, what you do. Like, speaking of digital economy, like generally, why do you think China overtook America and where China is still behind America?
Let's first of all make sure that everybody understands that China is 2 countries. China is the Beijing, Shanghai, Shenzhen, and large cities that you see in the news with big skylines. And it's also a different country. And I like my wife, my partner and I hike a lot. All right. And we go to very remote rural areas, and rural China is a different planet. It's a very poor place. People don't see it that way because they see Shanghai and Beijing and the big cities, but it's got this tremendous gap between what's going on in the big cities and what's going on in the rural areas. The biggest thing happening here that I see is the biggest focus, of course, is digital. I see digital as I am biased because it's what I do. So, but what I see happening here from a digital perspective is tremendous. So right now we're in the middle of what is commonly called an AI race. And I will submit to people, there is no race. Everybody will get AI. Everyone will use AI. It's not that AI will be better in China than the United States and one will conquer the other. No. AI is going to be everywhere. There's no race. We're all going to get it. Okay. But what I see on the digital front, I see digital technology and the use of digital technology to make your life better at a level in China that the US has not even fully comprehended. In other words, if you're living in the US and you think Amazon is really cool and Uber is really cool, great. I have no problem with that. I think those are great services. And yes, we have them in China, but we have those services and more. Okay. So we eclipse them. We've got stuff where buying airplane tickets. Okay. I bought a pair of airline tickets. Now I changed my plans. I refund the tickets immediately. I get an immediate refund on my airline tickets. Now I'm using that example specifically because anybody in the West knows that getting a refund on your deposit for a hotel room, if you have to put a deposit on, or for an airline ticket can take months. Right? Depending on when it is in the credit card cycle. So yeah, both China and the US have wonderful tech. And I'm sure anybody in the United States, you're thinking about Amazon, you're thinking about Uber. Look, China has all of those, but they're on steroids. Okay. There's a lot that China technology can do that is still not available in the West. And, particularly payments, digital payments, which is, of course, what I wrote a book about. And it's, of course, very near and dear to my heart as a former banker. But, the reality is the use of digital in China is really on another level. And, of course, and it's not just, who's winning the AI race. It's about the use of digital to make your life better on a daily basis. So QR codes, which is how we pay here, you scan a QR code, they're everywhere. You can just do a lot, like digital entry now. So, I have, of course, electronic passport entries. It's just really, and yes, we have that in the West too, I get it. But the use of digital here is paramount. Even small enterprises, are all on WeChat, and they're all able to build small applications on WeChat and run their business through them. It's really dramatic to see. So I think digital is one of the areas where I'm the most impressed, where I see China as being advanced. Now, that means something. So, and it really is an important point for those who do believe in an AI race, all right, which before I mentioned, doesn't really exist. But if you really believe that it exists, okay, fine. It doesn't matter who's got the smartest AI. What matters is who uses it, who's able to roll it out, who's able to implement AI in a meaningful method. And that's where China is going to eclipse the United States, because they roll out new software, new products at an incredible speed that the West can't really match. That's part of it. Now, so what does China do worse? Okay, so what's the good and what's the bad? I'm struggling to find something for the most that China does worse. People are expecting me to say, well, the government's terrible. And, that's not something I can say because I don't really feel it. I don't feel the government's terrible. But you don't have representation. And to which my answer is no. But, we actually know. So the thing that people are going to say, oh, it's worse because you don't vote and you don't have representation. Well, I'm a foreigner. I couldn't vote. So anyway, but we do have representation, and that's sort of the interesting part, and it's hard to get across to people. So, look, obviously, people are under the impression that everything is commanded from Beijing down, and that's not really quite the case. And in fact, we have very active local representation in government, and it's funny because in my apartment compound, there's a lady she doesn't live there, but she's part of the local organizing committee for probably 1 or 2 square blocks around Shanghai, all right? But her name is Annie, and we know her. And Annie, every couple of weeks, stands outside the door or the gateway of our compound. I live in a compound with 4 36-story buildings. So, there's 1,300 people living there. And Annie asks people, what's bothering me? And, for me, I don't have any complaints, but what's really interesting is that when people complain about cars parking on the street improperly or something needing fixing or something needs to be done in the neighborhood, not of course with your apartments. The apartments have a separate management team, but for our neighborhood, she handles that. And so, and we see her and she's visible. So, the concept that Chinese people live there and don't have any say into their lives and are just controlled by Beijing is just so far from reality. So that's what people would expect me to say. That the government is the problem. In fact, in many of the advances that China has, including digital, were from the government. So already back in 2002, 2003, in one of the 5-year plans, I think it's the 12th or something, 12th 5-year plan. First of all, China has something called a 5-year plan, where they look out 5 years and they plan for that period of time, which is quite remarkable since the U.S. changes governments every 4 years and has a 2-year cycle based on midterm elections. But I digress. But, China recognized the importance of digital back in early 2003, 4, somewhere around there. And they mandated that all of the little villages would get then 3G data service poured into them because the government realized that with 1.4 billion people, digital services were the way that they were going to be able to actually reach people in a meaningful manner. So anyway, so government is not perfect. It certainly has issues. Some of them are very clear in the newspaper. And country has problems. We have a housing crisis, or housing real estate crisis where they overbuilt real estate. There were a lot of shady deals. I don't want to go into that in detail, but it's certainly not causing the collapse of China as many would seem. So yeah, there's problems. It's not a carefree, perfect Shangri-La environment where everything is wonderful. Sure, we got lots of problems here. But overall, it's a pleasant place to live. And most of the guests that I have that come here all tell me the same thing. This is not what we envisioned. We didn't know it would be like this. We had no idea that particularly Shanghai was such a vibrant and, and fascinating city. So most people have a vision of China and a vision of Shanghai that is very different than reality.
What's the most fascinating technology that you've seen, and maybe like the technology that surprised your, I don't know, American friends? Like for us, it's now like the plan is I want to go to Shenzhen. We are shooting video there, and we want to like show all the like technologies that you can find in Shenzhen, from flying drones to self-driving taxis and stuff. If someone asks you, what's the most fascinating technology for you that you've seen in China?
It's really funny. I just did a trip with a bunch of CEOs from Europe, and the thing that impressed them the most, and the thing that impressed most of my guests over the years the most, are the high-speed rail, because most people have never been on a train, going 200, 250 miles an hour, or 300, I don't remember how many kilometers, kph now. And, so the first time you put somebody on the high-speed train and you get them the first class area, which is, lay flat kind of bed thing, it's remarkable. It really is. And, you're going, on that trip between Shanghai and Beijing, and, it's 3 easy hours. And, you're sitting there on the train and it's absolutely flat. And then they say, but I have cell phone. You'll have cell phone you'll have signal uninterrupted from Shanghai to Beijing on this line, no problem. So it's really that sure, the drones are great, the robots are fun, and payment technology people don't really care about, even though I wrote a book on it. Unless you're in the business, they're just like, you paid. That's all that people care about, right? But I think the train is what really makes people the most excited that I've seen.
好，理查德·图灵的分享我们就先看到这里。我觉得他的这段分析有意思的地方在于他用一个局外人的视角，把我们很多人可能已经习以为常或者西方世界完全误解了的事情给重新讲了一遍。首先从新加坡和中国的文化差异，他告诉我们即便同为华人社会，内核也可以完全不同。在对比中美思维方式时，他又点出了那个重要区别，是崇尚个人英雄主义还是更倾向于集体协作。然后他用一句很直接的我住在这里，我没看到崩溃，戳破了网上那些中国崩溃论的泡沫。所以你看，他其实在描绘一幅图景，一个在外界看来充满谜团的中国，在内部其实遵循着一套自己的非常务实的运转逻辑。在他眼中，中国是一个正在以惊人的速度将未来科技融入到社会毛细血管里的一个充满活力的复杂共同体。而这一点恰恰是很多西方观察者隔着屏幕无论如何也想象不到的。好，今天的分享就到这里，感谢大家收看，咱们下次再见。